Well, the election has happened and the balance of power has officially shifted in Australia, with younger generations now holding more electoral influence than the baby boomers. And here they are. It marks the beginning of a new political era, one that could redefine key policies around tax, super, even inheritance laws. As Gen Z and millennials now assert their dominance and their priorities, what changes should we expect in Australia and how it is governed? For more, we're joined at the desk by Dr. Stephen Entickett from CIA Tax, also host of Money Matters here on Ticker. Great to see you.
Well, Aaron, you and I are both political nuts, and if we look back over the last 20 years, I reckon we've reached a really pivotal point. Scott Morrison won an election that he probably shouldn't have won, which was the boomer power just hanging on. And then we had the election where he did lose, but Labor didn't really get, a full set of power. So Boomer was still just hanging on, and now in this election we've been swept out.
Right?
It's gone.
Yeah. It's interesting you say that, because growing up it felt like politics was very much something for older people. And now the idea that it really is changing. And yet another fascinating point is the Greens were pretty much wiped out.
That's right.
And we associated with the Greens with younger voters. So what's happening there, do you think?
Well, you've got extremism, haven't you? You've got far left and far right, theoretically,
far right,
and they're both gone. They've gone to middle Australia, if you like. It has got control of the vote. It reminds me of the 1990s when John Howard came into power and introduced GST. We had a new wave of government and spending that really did favour that boomer generation and went through. They've lost power now.
We called it middle class welfare, right? And
That's
the idea
right.
was your house prices go up, you'll be looked after. But it created an expectation, and now that has gone everywhere.
That's right, and it's coming to an end. We've lost power. We've moved into a new era now, a new era of bigger government, bigger spending. In Victoria, we certainly have that. It's probably gotten so big that everyone's got a vested interest to keep voting for the bigger government. That's starting to happen at that federal level now. We've got a bigger vested interest of people coming into the country that are going to vote for Labor, and it's going to be very hard to break that hold in the next few elections.
So what we're essentially saying is the Liberal Party will need to change to be at all competitive, right? So if you think about the idealistic nature post-World War II of a booming Australia, where the Liberals were small business, smaller government, you were smarter than government at spending your money, and then Labor had the kind of flow-on effects from the Labor Party that beat Winston Churchill in the UK, bringing through the idea of bigger government, social security, Medicare, pensions, the compassionate society as we call it. There's no desire anymore to have a debate about whether or not we should have a compassionate society. It is here. There are some within the Conservative side who just aren't getting with the party, and they seem to be making the Liberals where they are now.
Well, they've become irrelevant, with 40 seats against 91 seats or 92, 93, whatever ends up for Labor. They are irrelevant. I think it's actually an easy equation for the Liberals. When you've been cleaned out the way you've been cleaned out, you have to change. And I think if they jump on board being the aspirational party, we still want people to be aspirational in society, because as we know, big government gets to a point where people lose aspiration because taxes creep up, and it becomes a bit of a steady slope of decline as debt keeps piling up to keep feeding a big government until it all goes bust. So I think Liberals should be jumping onto aspiration. Become the aspirational party, become the point of difference that says we're against big government, big spending, big whatever. We're all about developing the young person coming through.
It's interesting within my friendship group watching during the election campaign to see what had an impact on them. Many of them don't usually vote. They don't have a huge care about politics. I'm the loudmouth at the party, always saying what I think.
I'm surprised to hear that, Aaron. That's a bit of a shock.
I learn from the best, which is why we go head to head. But the things that jumped on them were very much the Liberals' working from home policy, which was a disaster.
Crazy.
And it was a disaster because the Liberals were first the ones who brought in working from home when Scott Morrison locked down the country and handed things to the states. But secondly, when you talk about aspirational, it was saying that we believe we're smarter at what you should do with your time than what you should be able to do with your time. And if you happen to be a really intelligent person who can manage 2 full-time jobs from home, go for it. Earn as much money as you can. I just felt that it really hit out at the very people. It wasn't just women, it was young men as well who like to work from home because they don't like to work in an office.
Well, that was the key thing of the Liberal campaign, wasn't it? It was mixed messages.
Shocking.
And I think that's why they were wiped out. They weren't simple and online. They've got to go back to being on target. We support aspiration. And until they get there, I think they're going to be in the wilderness and irrelevant.
If you look at Australia, right, you've got New South Wales in the middle. You've got Victoria, which houses the extreme left, and you've got Queensland that houses the extreme extreme right. I'm generalising, but the further north you go, the further south you go, it happens in every country that you get extremism. The issue is with having a Liberal person from Queensland is that they can't help but be part of the LNP, which is what they are up there, meaning that the Nationals have a really strong view. But interestingly, as you would know, the Nationals are quite frankly socialists, just in a different way.
Well, I'm actually impressed with the Nationals policy. You know, everyone looks at the Greens and said they're a Green Party, or the Liberals, whatever. The Nationals are the one that actually introduced nature positive to us at all, you know, so they've actually got really good, strong messaging around that. Yes, they're for the country, yes, they're for farming, but they've also done some really good left-wing stuff as well too, so I agree with you. But I think what we really need to talk about, and what I'm here to talk about, is what's going to change. Taxes are coming. We've got a big government that already doesn't have enough revenue. It needs more revenue, and where's it going to get their revenue from, Aaron?
Well, the issue seems to be that this is the step that everyone's taken around the world. The United Kingdom has a far worse GDP to debt ratio, so does Canada, the United States, obviously trillions of dollars in debt. There is an expectation that you can't cut anymore. Quite often it would be the Libs will come in and cut too much, Labor will come in and spend too much. Now everyone just wants the spending, and I feel like COVID and JobKeeper really helped to create that expectation that the government will always look after me. Not going to have that debate about whether or not it should have happened.
Well, that was actually Liberal Party policy.
That's my point.
You know, so both of them are in the same camp to a degree. But, you know, if you've got to think about Australia, we're going to have more spending. We're already spending more than what we've got. It has to come from somewhere. So my question to people is, where's it going to come from? One of my big things is we are 1 in 10 countries in the whole OEC that do not have an inheritance tax. That's got to come, in my view. But I'd also argue that we already have that. If you die in superannuation, with superannuation, and you don't have a dependent, it's going to be taxed at 15 cents in the dollar.
All right, let's talk about housing, because both parties, I mean, I feel like we've been talking about housing in politics since I was a child, basically, and yet many people my age don't own a house. They can't get in, they can't be bothered, they can't buy where they need to live for work. It's not about wanting, it's need to live for work, and therefore they just turn a blind eye to it. And yet both parties keep telling people, we'll help you own your first home. If you watch Q&A, then you will see almost every episode is a person around 30 saying, I want to get into the housing market, but I can't. Do you think that there will be a push for change when it comes to negative gearing to increase the amount of houses available? Do you think that there will be changes to immigration so we can have more people building houses so that young people can buy them? What are your thoughts?
Absolutely, housing's a big issue, but we can pretend to have all the answers with negative gearing and tax and all these sorts of things, but the cold, hard reality is it's supply and demand. If you have more and more people coming into one area, it's going to push pricing up of houses. So we're going to have a big Australia. If we're going to have 30, 40, 50 million people in Australia, there is no way in the world the next generation can have a house. You've got to look at countries like Singapore. It's a small land mass with a lot of people. It's become an apartment dwelling society. That's all that can happen in Australia if we are going to become a bigger and a bigger Australia.
Well, we're seeing that, right? We're
That's
seeing
right,
it in
more
Victoria,
and more apartments.
The
And
Premier,
they are affordable.
The Premier Jacinda Ardern saying we're going to become the townhouse capital, and the idea will be that it will build up higher in many of these areas where there are trains already.
And that's what's going to keep it affordable. If you want a house, all you've got to do is move 2 or 3 hours from a capital city, and housing very, very cheap. And the reason it's cheap, you know, 200,000-300,000 to buy a house 3 hours from Melbourne. The reason it's cheap because people don't want to live there. So you've got supply and demand issues in these capital cities that can only be addressed by going up.
It is bizarre that Adelaide's population has stayed the same as it was in the 1990s. It is bizarre that Perth property prices have taken off, but it doesn't have that many more people than it did 20 years ago. It is strange that Australia has the same number of capital cities that it did have 200 years ago, and that we don't have more people. I mean, if people want to live by the water between Sydney and Melbourne, why aren't there more cities between Sydney and Melbourne?
Yeah, it's crazy.
You drive up the east coast of the United States, and every hour you bump into a huge city, Baltimore, Pennsylvania, obviously New York, Boston, on it goes, Washington, head south. And yet the areas where people want to live, we haven't invested to build more cities. It's just very, very odd. So where does it go from here in terms of some of the other policies? You mentioned inheritance tax and death tax.
Well, superannuation is probably going to be the key battleground. Paul Keating says we don't have a debt problem. We've got $3 trillion in super. Jim Chalmers, in one of his first budget speeches, said we don't, Australians at some point are going to have a talk about tax. In other words, they all know that we don't have debt. We've got superannuation sitting there. I think they're coming for superannuation more and more ways. The $3 million tax, they didn't inflict connect that to inflation. Each year, more and more people are going to get pushed up into
How
that.
do they take the super? How do they take super then? How would that work?
Yeah, so anyone who has a balance over 3 million, okay, not linked to inflation, so each year, 10 years, 20 years go by, that'll be nearly everybody coming up into that bracket. They're taxing gains that haven't even happened. So you might have an asset that's gone up. Farming's a great example. You might have a $3 million farm that goes to $4 million because it's been 2 good seasons in a row. You've got to pay an extra $150,000 tax, 3 droughts in a row. Your property is now worth $2.5 million. Is the government going to give you back the $150,000? Are they?
Do they ever give you anything back?
No, they're not going to give it back. They'll give you a credit. So they'll take tax on assets that have gone up in value, but if they go down in value, they won't give the money back. So we're seeing a change here where superannuation is going to change, but they're going to move on taxing, my view, all assets. London in particular is working on this as well, on all assets before you actually see the profit. So if you have Bitcoin, you'll be paying tax before you even cash your Bitcoin in.
What usually happens in Australia has happened in the UK already.
Exactly.
Seems to be what
We're
happens.
following
And
France before that.
right now we are watching a lot of millionaires and aspirational people leaving the United Kingdom and looking around. Some of them are coming to Australia and then saying, oh, wait a sec, it's no better here either. What is the risk when countries start to lose aspirational workers?
Well, you get stuck in a trap, don't you? You've got a bigger and bigger bucket or a bigger engine to feed and not enough people putting petrol in. So you start taking and borrowing until something goes wrong. And when something goes wrong, we all know we head into recession, depression, whatever, and then we've got to reset and move on again from there. It can't end well. If you take aspiration out of a society, you're not going to be able to feed what we want to feed from an empathy and a care and a lifestyle perspective. If you haven't got people who are aspirational, if you take away their drive and they go offshore, they go somewhere else, where's the revenue going to come from?
One of the interesting things you often hear from people who are elderly is that concern about national debt. You never hear young people talking about it. It's not a fear at all for young people about how much the government owes. All they care about is our social policies being met. What do you think that to me is the key difference between the older generation and the younger generation?
Yeah.
And they look towards the United States with a $30 trillion debt, and they say, well, it's worse over there. We look at Greece. What really ended up happening? Not much changed. The austerity measures across the UK that feel like they've never ended as well. There just seems to be no appetite to worry about it and just to keep going. How does a government deal with a population that doesn't want to see cuts?
It only becomes a problem when people stop buying the treasury bonds that are issued by those countries. So if people are still buying the treasury bonds, it's like a giant Ponzi scheme. I'm not going to repay this debt. I'm going to issue another T-bond to be able to pay the interest and the debt on the last one. And then I've got another treasury bond and I've got another treasury bond. At the moment, the whole world's got a vested interest in buying those treasury bonds from whichever country in the world. One day it's got to end. You know, you can't just keep printing money and expecting people to take it. It will end one day, whether it's today, whether it's 10 years' time, whether it's 30 years' time. There will need to be a reset or a global reset. A lot of conspiracy theories around 2030. But some point, the windmill of just creating money has to end because people will go, I don't want it, I'm going to take it. Places like Australia will fare better because we've got a lot of land, we've got a lot of gold, we've got a lot of minerals, we've got a lot of everything. So Australia will always bounce through, in my view, but we always have to end up in tough times.
What was that famous saying? If you're not a socialist in your 20s, you haven't got a heart. If you're a socialist in your 40s, you haven't got a brain. But it seems to be extending out now.
Yeah, I guess, and I think one more important point is, what is money? Money is just a blip on a computer screen.
True.
So if I was a younger person, which I like to identify with at times, I sit and go, well, what's a currency? Seriously. What has survived history? Real assets, gold, land, whatever. But at the end of the day, money's just a blip on a computer screen. I've got this feeling one day the governments of the world are just going to go, nah, that debt's all gone. Here's our new digital currency. Let's go forward.
Let's get on to that. Let's buy it now if we can.
Another day.
Stephen Anticut, appreciate your time as always. Thank you.